Thank you so much, Christina, and everyone there at COS. We're really, really excited to be here. We were talking about it before the program that we feel it is quite an honor to be able to present to the Chicago Ornithological Society. I am going to share my screen. So we're talking about what I think is a super fascinating phenomenon, and that is nesting today. Just a quick show of hands, Zoom hands, or put in the chat. Has anyone ever done the activity where they try and build a nest out of, grasses or sticks or anything like that with their own hands? Yeah, I got a thumbs up from Edward there. So some folks have. Yeah, it's really, really difficult, right? And every time that I try and do that activity, which is something we usually do with kids, I am amazed that birds do it really just with their beaks and feet, not their hands with opposable thumbs. So it really is, I think, a wonder of engineering. Just a brief intro about myself. I'm actually from Northern Illinois, from Naperville originally. Please don't hold it against me. Love the city of Chicago, so I was like triple excited when Christina contacted us to be able to do this program. I've been out of Illinois since 1999 though, and did some grad work at Arkansas State University and traveled around doing bird jobs and nothing but bird jobs for several years before Ethan and I co-founding the Missouri River Bird Observatory in 2010. About our organization's work, briefly, our tagline is conservation via science, education, and advocacy. And we kind of have these 4 pillars, also known as our eggs, that we incubate, and hopefully they will hatch and take flight and make a difference in the conservation world. So these pillars are quality habitats, feeding the flock, which refers to a focus on building sustainable agricultural systems, something that's really important, of course, for both Missouri and Illinois in terms of habitat availability for birds and water quality and good food for people. Bird-friendly communities, so encouraging everyone from urban core, all the way up to rural areas, how to make their area more friendly for birds during migration, nesting, basically the entire life cycle, and then getting people out into nature to enjoy and appreciate our resources. So let's see, there we go. Moving Zoom screens around a little bit here. There we go. So tonight we're going to talk about why make nests, the main types of nests and a few examples of those, both sort of in some that are possible in our own backyards, no matter where those backyards might be, and some out in sort of more rewilded situations, and then studying and conserving nesting birds, some interesting and exciting and inspiring community science possibilities, and then have time for questions from y'all at the end. So why make a nest? And I think this is a little bit intuitive. One thing I'd point out is that not all, as we'll see, not all birds really make a nest as we think of it. And we're defining that as simply a place where a bird lays and incubates its eggs and then raises its young, whatever time frame that might be. And as we know, it differs extraordinarily between different species. But here's some of the benefits of having a nest at all. So shelter from the elements, of course, and from predators as well. Warmth, maybe not such a huge issue right at this moment in time, but obviously for birds that start nesting earlier, especially those in April and May, warmth is going to be a big consideration. Cushioning, camouflage, of course, again, from predators, and all of the safety factors that go into all of these things. So basically, it is simply a very complex endeavor made to keep young birds safe and to keep them alive to fledging and beyond. So this is, I found this a little bit challenging to try and stick with main types of nests, because there are, in fact, definitely variations on these themes, if you will. But we're going to talk about 8 main types of nests briefly tonight. The cup nest, which is probably the most familiar to all of us, cavity nests, platforms, scrapes, burrow nests, pendant or suspended nests. Christina, you asked a little bit about orioles, and that's the kind of nest that they make, and then adherent nests. So let's just kind of go through these. And I think one thing that might be fun to think about is just sort of the availability of each of these nest types in terms of where birds put them, the complexity of engineering and building these types of nests, and then the various benefits for each one. So let's talk about that a little bit. Oops, I didn't get to 8, a mound nest. So a cup nest, again, I think, possibly not with you all as experienced bird watchers and ornithologists, like you might be more familiar with the various kinds of nests, but I think when we talk to folks that aren't necessarily as into birds as we all are, this is the type of nest that they're going to think of. And these are the nests that we often see on our homes and structures, a cup nest. So they're open at the top in bowl shape. They're exposed to the elements, which can be very problematic, as we will see. Nesting time is usually quick for those same reasons. So if you have eggs and then young that are in a cup-shaped nest and it is exposed to the elements to some degree or another, depending on where it's placed, and it is relatively fairly exposed to predation as well, you are going to want to get your breeding cycle done as quickly as possible, right? And get your young out into the world and hopefully flying around as quickly as possible. Nesting success is usually relatively low. We'll talk a little bit more about that between nest types, and Ethan's going to discuss a little bit about some data that we collected on one of our own projects. But relatively low, kind of sad. And here's some examples of birds that build cup nests. So cardinals, blue jays, robins, as you see here, ruby-throated hummingbird, and prairie birds called dickcissels. So, and that's just a few examples. There are a lot of different cup nesters out there. So just to give you, I think, a little bit of a preview of what Ethan will tell you about, it's tough out there, and a lot of the grassland birds that we study are cup nesters. And obviously, if you're in a prairie ecosystem, there isn't going to be a lot of height to your nest, right? So you kind of have that going against you as well. Like, you don't have your cup nest 45 feet up, which is quite a bit safer than being on the ground or being a couple of feet high in a shrub. And sometimes we're seeing, and this is really pretty common among cup nesting birds, 15 to 35% nest success. I started off my ornithological career working with woodpeckers, and they have cavity nests. And when I eventually got to a couple projects where I was working on cup nesting birds, I became extremely depressed, because I was like, in comparison to cavity nesting birds, which often have nest success rates up in the like 80 to 90 percentile, and you start studying birds that have nest success around 20 to 35%, it is kind of sad. And you start wondering, like, how are their populations really reproducing at all in comparison? So cavity nests are basically holes in trees. They can be excavated by animals. Woodpeckers particularly are considered keystone species because of their ability and activity of excavating holes in trees. Or you can have, of course, holes that have occurred due to a knot in the tree or a branch coming off, things like that. Clearly, these types of nests are going to be much better protected from the elements than cup nests. They're not open. And often there are other factors, such as the run of tree sap, for instance, that will help protect from predators. So both elements and predators, these are a lot safer. Nesting time is usually longer accordingly, and in many cases quite a lot longer. A lot of our cup nesting birds have a nestling period, so from the time the eggs hatch until the time the young fledge, of like 10 to 14 days. For hairy woodpeckers, for example, that time is 28 days. So it's substantially longer, because they can basically afford, because of the safety provided by cavity nests, they can afford to raise their young for a longer time. And as I said, nest success is a lot higher. So birds that build and or use cavity nests: woodpeckers, eastern bluebird, chickadees, titmice, house wren, prothonotary warblers, and lots more. with this being such an advantageous nesting strategy, you'd think that there could be even more, but cavities are limited, right? There are only so many naturally, quote unquote, occurring holes in trees. There are only so many woodpeckers out there making cavities. And I do want to add that a lot of mammals and some insects will also use these cavity nests. So there is a fair amount of competition for this type of nest. So here's just a couple of photos of nuthatches using, they're using the cavities secondarily. So we call them secondary cavity nesters, and thanks to woodpeckers for making cavities. A platform nest, this is one that folks might be quite familiar with. Ospreys, some of our large raptors, great horned owls often will build this type of nest. It's relatively simple. It's usually large and conspicuous. I'm sure folks have probably seen a nest or two of this type, and they're big. Typically, they're towards the top of trees or other tall structures. Some folks put out platforms specifically for ospreys, particularly to build their stick platform nests upon. And they're pretty much exclusively sticks, unlike some other species that we'll see a whole bunch of different substrate into their nest. So typically the bigger birds that make what we think of as platform nests, great blue heron, egrets, some folks mentioned in the chat black-crowned night herons, so herons also will make this type of nest. So this is the nest that I referred to that's not exactly built. It's a scrape nest, and it's essentially a shallow depression on the ground. It might have a light lining of down and grass. The most familiar, and what you see pictured here, are killdeer nests that might occur in driveways, along the sides of roads, gravel parking lots, basically pretty dangerous places. I've known a lot of people that have found these nests in their immediate surrounds and sort of flagged them, so nobody walked on them or anything like that, because they're very, very difficult to see. The minimalist architecture is basically the defense, so the eggs look like the rocks upon which these nests are made. And here are some of the birds that build these before driveways and gravel right-of-ways and things like that. This would have been on things like river gravel bars, is an example of where birds might have put these to be camouflaged. Out west, there's a species called the mountain plover. And that bird just kind of makes their scrape nest on bare ground. And a lot of times that is done on agricultural land. And the Rocky Mountain Bird Observatory had a longstanding program helping farmers that noticed those nests to put up, flagging or flags around them to make sure those nests were conserved. So that was kind of a neat project involving scrape nests. A burrow nest, I had a very difficult time finding any photos of a burrow nest other than burrowing owls. And there aren't a lot of bird species that use this type of nest, but burrowing owls are not the only one. And this is basically a hole in the ground or along the bank of a stream. And so our, quite common belted kingfisher uses this nest strategy. I just don't think that kingfisher nests are found and photographed as certainly not as often as burrowing owl nests are. So here's where we get to these even more intricately woven nests, suspended nests or pendant nests. And one thing that I found interesting is I would have originally called this a pendant nest, right? P-E-N-D-A-N-T, like the pendant of a necklace. But what I learned in putting together this presentation and doing some background research is that that is the noun, and pendant, spelled with an E, is the adjective. So that is not a typo, although I would have thought so until a couple days ago. But our pendant or suspended nests are elaborately woven sacks dangling from branches. And this one that is pictured here is in fact a Baltimore Oriole nest right there. Some are not suspended very far down from branches, but some can hang several feet below the attachment point. Oops, and here is just some examples of these nest builders. So orioles, of course, and many vireos. And here are a couple wonderful pictures from Missouri. These are actually from our photo contest. And both of these photographers got really close up and amazing pictures of white-eyed vireos in their pendant nest. Adherent nest, constructed by one of the cutest birds in the universe, which is the barn swallow. This is one of my favorite bird species. And adherent, of course, they are stuck to something. The stickiness can be from mud, from the bird's saliva, or from sap. And here are examples of birds that build these adherent nests. So swallows, of course. And this is a situation where you have variations, right? So the barn swallow builds essentially an adherent nest that is an open cup nest. It's typically in a location where there is, some roof overhang or whatever, or in a non-human situation on a cliff side. But cliff swallows and bank swallows will build those elaborate, like they're almost gourds with tunnel entrances, and they're adherent nests too, but their structure and shape is very, very different than the barn swallow. So chimney swifts as well, and then eastern phoebe sort of, and we'll get to that. They do make an adherent nest, but it's not as fully adherent where it can stick to a vertical surface without any other support typically, whereas the swallows do that without support. So a mound nest, fairly simple type of nest. Here's a couple examples. Some of our waterfowl do this, flamingos do so. There's some really interesting pictures on the internet. If you ever looked up flamingo mound nest, they were all things that they're not my photos, so I couldn't put them in a presentation, but I definitely encourage folks to check that out. They're really interesting. And some coot species. And so you can see this Canada goose here on an example of a mound nest in the top right, and then a couple pictures from one of our wetland field projects. That is a bit of an island that you're seeing here on the left hand side, that goose nest that's within a bunch of vegetation, and then a different example of one and kind of the nice comfy looking down lining that bird put in their nest. So nesting, like birding, identification of nests. Is it possible? It's possible, certainly. I think it's pretty tough in some cases. If you just find a nest and the builder, the family is not around, it can be very difficult. But there are some things to consider if you want to be nesting and identifying nests. So the timing, of course, this varies pretty widely by species. We have, for example, birds like northern bobwhite and some others that start nesting really early. Down here in Missouri, we only have a few of them left, but greater prairie chickens are doing their courtship rituals in March and April and nesting at that time, so really early. Whereas, of course, our neotropical migrants aren't really nesting until May typically. So some timing is a good thing to consider. The location, of course, is it on the ground? Is it in a tree? Is it in a shrub? Where in those structures is it? Or on a building? And then, of course, the composition and shape of the nest. I think, thinking about those basic nest types that we just talked about is one good way to start narrowing it down. Is the nest solitary, or are there many nests together, as in the picture here that Ethan took? And then, if possible, looking at the size, shape, and color of the eggs is, of course, very helpful, and the amount of eggs as well. So this is a great guide, wonderful. It's just, even if you're not going out and finding nests and looking at them, it's a beautiful, beautiful book, and the plates are just really attractive and interesting. And so that is the one that we would recommend if you were going to seriously get into nesting, nest IDing. And Eve, I believe you're going to talk a little bit more about the resource of nestwatch.org a bit later. Just some words of caution, if you will, to bring up. And this is something that we have thought long and hard about, because we ran the nesting project that Eve's going to tell you a little bit about in a minute. And this is good stuff to know, even if you already, as ethical birders and maybe bird photographers, you might know these sorts of things, but it's also a good thing to be able to pass along to other people. But being careful to just really avoid harming a nest. Ground nesting birds' nests are obviously particularly easy to step on in a prairie or maybe wetland situation, not causing parental desertion and not attracting predators to the nest. Of course, without a permit, we are not allowed to possess nests or eggs. And there are great guidelines on nestwatch.org that you can see while you're getting ready to do some nest monitoring. So just wanted to bring up a few examples of ones that we might have around us. Robin, of course, as you see pictured here, very much on a human structure on a porch. This was taken in St. Louis. And it was very difficult to pick a few, but and this is by no means an exhaustive list of what we might find around us. But ruby-throated hummingbird, very, very difficult nest to find, notoriously difficult, but a super interesting and gorgeous nest. It can be in a variety of tree species. Here are some average heights. It's attached to a small twig or branch, typically slanting downward, usually sheltered above by leafy branches, making it even more difficult to see than it already was. But the really neat thing about hummingbird nests is how they're made and what they're made of. And they're something, many, many types of nests in their way are elaborate and intricate, but this is probably one of the most elaborate in terms of all of the different ingredients, if you will, that are listed here. And one of the reasons that the species uses spider webs, spider silk, is to allow for stretchiness of the nest. So as you can imagine, hummingbird eggs are really, really tiny. And as you can see from this picture here, they eventually grow so big that the nest, the little teeny tiny nest, is not really containing them anymore, but it does stretch a bit. So here's the diameter and the height. Very small, and this is all undertaken by the female hummingbird alone. I wanted to bring up this species because I don't know how common they are in your area, honestly. We do kind of have them around our backyard, but we're a little bit more rural. But when I have seen examples of a blue-gray gnatcatcher nest, I mean that somebody has found and brought to ask for identification, I often go back and forth wondering if it's a hummingbird nest or a blue-gray gnatcatcher nest. They're fairly similar, even if you see them really close up, and you can see why. The ingredients are largely the same, and often covered, with bits of lichen on the outside. They are a little bit bigger though, of course, because it's a little bit bigger of a bird, but they're placed in really similar situations too. So just as you're looking at nests, or if someone asks you to identify a nest, just kind of be aware that these two species have pretty similar looking nests. Eastern phoebe, this is a favorite around houses. This bird nests on shelf-like projections, constructed of what you see there. And one thing that I think is interesting is that they're kind of semicircular when they're attached to the wall, that adherent nature, but they're circular if they have more of a bottom substrate. And I think if I can get this to play, hopefully folks are seeing this. Ethan actually took this video at my mom's house, and that's a phoebe nest. We put up that shelf actually specifically because they kept trying to kind of adhere to that top beam there, and it was touch and go. We were worried about it. So that shelf was erected there specifically for the phoebes that come and nest every year, and I think that was their second nest this year. Yeah, and we actually saw them fledge as well. And then finally, one backyard favorite that I think everyone loves, northern cardinal. They are typically nests in dense shrubbery. For as conspicuous as cardinals are, their nests can be pretty hard to find. They're usually below 10 feet, and you can see there how they're relatively loosely woven of twigs, vines, etc. And they're often lined with hair. Sometimes we have 3 goats here, and sometimes they have our goat hair in the nest if we find it. Thinking of nesting cardinals made me think of nest parasitism, because cardinal is one of the most frequently parasitized nests by brown-headed cowbirds. You can see the male and female cowbird there on the left-hand side. And I don't know if folks have found a nest that had one very odd man out kind of egg in it. The nest that you see in the upper right there is a phoebe nest, with one brown-headed cowbird egg in it. And pictured here at the bottom is something that I think is pretty illustrative of the size difference between brown-headed cowbird young, and in this case a fledgling, and their host, which in the picture there is a song sparrow. We've certainly seen chipping sparrows feeding brown-headed cowbird young, and it's a pretty darn extreme size difference. So, you know, the strategy of the cowbirds is to simply lay eggs in other birds' nests, as many as they can, as often as they can. And then typically the cowbird young grows quite a bit faster than the host young, out competing them. So it doesn't always result in a total failure of the host nest, but it can, and it typically results in certainly less fledglings on the part of the host, if any do make it at all. I feel that this species is somewhat often vilified because of this strategy, but it is a native species. And a lot of the reason that cowbirds have become more and more successful is because of habitat fragmentation by us, letting them get into the edges and really getting to parasitize more nests than they would have if we had had a, you know, very intact landscape. We also have nest thieves. So our invasive species, particularly starlings, as you see here in a woodpecker cavity, they're extremely aggressive. Even the normally fairly protective and agitatable red-headed woodpecker loses fights against European starlings. And then, of course, house sparrows. And I just wanted to relate what I think is kind of a funny story. Have folks heard the legend that starlings and house sparrows, amongst others, were originally introduced in this country because people wanted to introduce all of these species that were mentioned in Shakespeare's sonnets? This is something that I heard for many, many years. There's like a little tiny grain of truth that Shakespeare was involved at all, but really, these species were in fact intentionally introduced, but the house sparrow was actually introduced in order to save New York City's trees in the 1850s from the linden moth, which was ravaging the trees, and it was a known predator in the old world of the linden moth, whereas the European starling was introduced largely by the American Acclimatization Society, which sought to introduce to the New World, quote, such foreign varieties of the animal and vegetable kingdoms as may be useful or interesting. And I'm going to put this article in the chat once I stop screen sharing, because it's just sort of a really interesting historical look at how we ended up with 540 million house sparrows and 220 million starlings in this country. At the time, there was little evidence available just to suggest just how misguided this mission was. So I'm going to conclude with just a little bit about nest boxes and nest monitoring. It kind of goes along with the starling and house sparrow thing, because a lot of our nest box maintenance and construction and planning is is done around keeping out invasive species, as well as native predators. So just a little bit about that. There's some wonderful information online if you want to become a bluebird landlord or a purple martin landlord, or whether that's on your property or if it's if it's a community effort that you undertake, both to provide nesting habitat for certain species and get other volunteers involved. There's a lot of different interesting things, I think, to be able to do with nest box landlording. But some of the important considerations are just making sure that the housing is really, really safe. And there's a lot of great information out there. I'm just wanted to share a couple things from the Missouri Bluebird Society. Baffles are really important to keep predators such as raccoons and snakes out. And portal guards, as you see here on the left, there are both bird and mammal species that will enlarge holes. And once you start messing with the hole specifications, you can easily get birds like starlings invading these houses. So having something like a portal guard is really important. I'm not going to read all of these things to you, but some important nest box features that help protect bluebirds and anything else that you might be trying to host in your box, like house wrens or titmice or chickadees. So having just important things that help with their survival, like it's well ventilated, especially in a summer like this one, right? And making sure that you keep predators out. I think this is becoming more and more common knowledge. I don't see as many bluebird houses just like nailed to trees, which was always done with good intentions, but we have since learned through box monitoring that having proper hardware and proper specifications for your boxes is really helpful with the bird's survival and nest success. So you might get other cool species as well, such as tree swallows, potentially using bluebird-sized boxes. And then I wanted to also bring up purple martin landlording. There's some great information on the Purple Martin Conservation Association website about safely providing housing for martins as well. So you can see that on the upper left there, that's a traditional gourd. It can't be cleaned. It can't be monitored. And we've determined, or folks working on this for many, many years have determined that monitoring actually increases nest success. That might be a tiny bit counterintuitive, because we think like if we keep looking at and disturbing the nest, that's not good. But if we do so on a infrequent but regular basis, we can identify problems as they're happening, such as mites, or it's not safe enough from predators or whatever, needs to be cleaned, needs to be further reinforced. It significantly improves the nesting success of boxes. So we've gone from things like the gourds that you can't clean and can't monitor to like really elaborate setups like this one, with proper purple martin housing. You can see the shortened entrance so that starlings can't get in. And you can see this is a screw top, basically, so that you can look in and monitor and clean as necessary. And that is it for me. I will turn it over to Ethan. Thank you, everyone, for your attention.
So I'm originally from Western New York, and a really cool place. Originally home to like huge flocks of passenger pigeons that would feed on large stands of beech and oaks. And it's also the original land of the Iroquois Federation. So I've had the privilege of like Dana did, of going a lot of places, having a lot of bird jobs, working for a lot of different entities and agencies. And a lot of that did involve like nest monitoring type projects around studying bird nests. And I'm going to get into that a little bit later. But I just want to kind of start with kind of how we think about nests and the structure of nests a little bit more, but just kind of in a way of art and maybe a little bit science, both. This here is, I mean, if you think about it, if a bird hatches out of an egg and eventually it goes and it creates this without any instruction, not being taught, it creates these beautiful nests. It uses only parts of its environment to do so, and it knows kind of what to pick to make it the most successful it can be. So just being able to incorporate all those elements without any instructions, just a wonder in itself, let alone how they end up just being so beautiful. And this particular nest here is a phoebe nest that I found just on the inside of a cave in the Cumberland Mountains. And Dana showed you that one earlier, and that is typical. We see them on human structures, but it was just kind of a neat thing. I was like, wow, I guess they do make them in nature as well. So it's something we'll circle back to, but just thinking about how amazing they are and how beautiful they are. Not far from where I found that nest, I took this photo of a blue-headed vireo gathering nesting material. And on this particular project, I was really fortunate to see a lot of great birds building their nests, a lot of warblers in particular. And the project was focused on this gem of a bird. It was focused on cerulean warblers. And this is my Mexican colleague, Faustino. And it was just a fun and challenging thing of finding cerulean warbler nests and monitoring for them. Perhaps you can see me about 60 feet up in a black cherry tree up there. I'm carrying an extendable painter's pole that we'd affix a mirror on. And then my colleagues out on the ground would look up with their binoculars and look at the reflection in the mirror to try to count nestlings and eggs. And cerulean warbler nests, I mean, they get way up there and they can be really difficult to see. There's one digiscope through a spotting scope. You can just kind of see it. And sometimes they're protected by leaves over them. So it's hard to even see them there. But it's really challenging. So it makes you think, why would biologists go through all this effort to all these challenges to monitor nests? You know, it seems like it'd be a lot easier just go out to count the birds or something else. Why would they be doing this on steep mountain slopes or any other dangerous place? Sometimes people go and monitor nests. Well, for one thing, it's really important to understand the limiting factors to bird populations in general. And oftentimes that's a combination of different things. It can be any stage of the bird's life history, but nesting seems to be a really crucial stage to look at and pay careful attention to. So it's happened time and time again in ornithological history where a great discovery is made just through observing nesting. And after all, if it weren't for Derek Ratcliffe back in the day, we might have a few less species. Has anybody here, maybe somebody knows? You can type in the chat, maybe if you've heard of Derek Ratcliffe before. Derek Ratcliffe, he was a British ornithologist who made notes dating back to 1958 in British Bird magazine, and he noticed thinning eggshells in Dana, can you? Hey. Then he made note of thinning eggshells in raptors and Aries. And that later study, sorry, just had a distraction there. Later we figured out that not only were British raptors facing trouble, especially peregrine falcons, other species like their hobby over there and their kestrel, and they're going through serious declines. And he was like, why do these eggs keep breaking? There's something up with this. And they did a little census and said, well, our populations are declining. Then they asked us over in the US, what's going on with your peregrines? And they're like, well, we can't find a successful nest. And so then they looked around and they found out the cause was sublethal amounts and sometimes lethal amounts of toxic chemicals. In this case, it was insecticides. In this case, it was DDT. In particular, that was, it was a persistent organochlorine pesticide affecting them. And so in any event, it's the observation of a nest and nesting that led to that discovery. There's a lot of hemming and hawing within the industry culture, trying to deny the ties, but eventually logic and science ruled the day, and we were able to ban DDT, and we were able to see the success. I mean, we did end up losing one of our peregrine subspecies, the duckhawk, but the duck peregrine, but we were able to save a lot, and we see a lot of our raptors rebounding now because of it. But nesting is that challenging time and that vulnerable time. Dana mentioned it, especially with those open cup nesters, and especially those open cup nesters on the ground. So Dana did mention briefly our grassland bird nest monitoring project, and here's one of those vulnerable little birds. This is a nestling eastern meadowlark, and one of many found during our monitoring project. And we're trying to assess the effects of a grassland management practice called patch burn grazing to see its effect on grassland bird populations. And along the way, our field project leader at the time, Eric Ost, is an exceptional field project leader, very methodical nest monitor, very conscientious, put together a whole collection of identification tools for the crew. And he also put together a handy reference thing of their focal species, nest, eggs, nestlings, and fledglings. And it's pretty remarkable. We'll take a look at some of that, but we produced reports on that project and looked at the nesting success of across species, within species, different things. For various reasons, we couldn't find any solid correlates between patch burn grazing and the treatments versus the controls, but we did learn a lot. And what we found is, generally speaking, like we suspected, nesting success is really low. If they're really, really having a good year within a particular group of species, it's going to be maybe 35 to 40%. And maybe Bell's vireos or some of these shrub nesting birds have a little bit higher success. But the birds down closer to the ground are having a more and more difficult time. Sometimes that's predation, sometimes it's weather dependent. There's a variety of factors that go into it. But all this to say, it's tough being a ground nesting bird, especially in the prairies. And so I guess I'll just jump through some of these right now, just to try to show you how wonderful some of these grassland obligate species birds' nests are and what they kind of look like. So the Bell's vireo, which is, we take some pride in here in Missouri, because that was one of the bird species discovered in Missouri. But they kind of have that pendulous nest shape. They're in small shrubs. They have these beautifully light, pale colored eggs with a few flecks on them. Baby birds are notoriously difficult. So you'll see these baby bird photos and they're all going to look kind of similar. But once they start growing some feathers, you'll see some of the difference in them. But then, yeah, it's important to know the fledglings and what they look like so we can sort of assess their success there too. But that's Bell's vireo. Our most ubiquitous grassland bird here is our dickcissels. What beautiful blue eggs they often have. And stark contrast, you'll see those cowbird eggs that often appear in their nest too. Beautiful little nestlings with yellow gapes, and they start looking pretty much like the adults as soon as they hatch out of there. But you can see in that upper right photo, you can just sort of see one just down in the shrubs there getting pointed out. They can be very difficult to find, even though they're common nesting in our prairies, but not as difficult as something like the eastern meadowlark sometimes, which sort of really puts it right down in the ground and almost like a cave-like entrance that goes in there. They can be particularly sensitive to human disturbance and particularly prone to abandonment. So we have to be very careful around them. Field sparrows, shrub nesting birds, pretty common, pretty likely to get predated or have brood parasitism. but more often in a shrub rather than in the grasses, and often a little bit less concealed than some of the other grassland birds. Not so much dependent on all the grass and forby structures. They just need a couple little shrubs in there, and it really helps, especially a good little clump of them along the riparian zone. It's often a good place to find them. Grasshopper sparrows, they like areas that were recently burned and or grazed. If an area is not, if it doesn't have some sort of disturbance or management like that, traditionally it would have been bison and Native Americans maintaining the landscape. But as long as somebody burns it recently, they'll be occupying that area with a lot sparser vegetation, less litter and thatch, and less forbs. But they're a difficult nest. They can be a difficult one to find, but because they like a little thinner, they can be a little bit easier than the Henslow sparrow to find. And Henslow's like that, a little bit thick, couple year or two post burn, depending on rainfall, and a little bit of a forby environment. And I find these definitely the most challenging grassland birds nests to find. But what beautiful gems, what's beautiful splotches, almost looks like a little bit of a round egg. I mean, all these eggs have there's a lot of terms. If you're an oologist and you're one who studies eggs, you'll pay particular attention to egg shape as well as the pigmentation on them. Our bobwhite quail, they're very susceptible to things like weather as well as predation. There's a lot of factors that go into their productivity full life cycle, but they have a very large clutch of eggs. They put a lot of investment into one, a big brood of eggs early in the spring. So extreme weather events like really a flash of rain and cold weather can just be really detrimental to an entire population in a given year. But they're absolutely cute, and they come out and they're precocial, so they're running around. So when you're looking at nesting success, I saw a question pop up in the chat there, what is nesting success? Well, it depends on what you think, like what time frame you're looking at, but you can look at nesting success as soon as the birds hatch, or as soon as the nest is built, from nest build to the young successfully fledging out and making it out of the nest and being fed in the environment. Or you can look at it as a factor of daily success. What is the chances of success any given day at any stage within their life cycle? So a lot of times when we do analysis, we'll look at that daily survival as well as full life cycle, full survival of the nest. So that helps you kind of identify maybe what stages might be problematic as well. So out there on the prairie, we find a lot of other wonderful, uniquely beautiful nests and eggs out there, and which brings me back to the structures themselves. And not only they provide us with this really great window to learn through the scientific method of understanding, but no matter how long we spend out in the field studying them scientifically, rigorously, they always are just so beautiful, and they bring us so much joy. So there's some in here that are my favorites. I don't know if you look through these, maybe you'll pick out some that for some reason just strike you as exceptionally beautiful. But now's a great time to get your fellow humans out there, even in urbanized environments, and help them find and understand that these things are existing in our environments. And I think it'll benefit everybody, just bringing that little bit of joy through nests and eggs. There's some great tools out there available to help us do that too. But on these ones here, I'll just have to say number 13 is like one of my favorites, that red-winged blackbird. It looks like calligraphy across it. That's just absolutely gorgeous. If we come back to the Phoebe nest, I thought of this as being it's weird because it was not on a human structure, but more often than not, it's the opposite, because we'll be like, oh, wow, I didn't expect any birds to be here, but they are there. And nature's like unexpected like that. And so we often think, hey, let's bring people to this really cool spot in nature to find some nature, when oftentimes that's not possible. And oftentimes, even in urban and suburban environments, there's a lot to be found there. So, anyways, it's a wonderful thing to share. And one way you can do that, one way that I enjoy doing that is through Project Nestwatch. And many of you may have heard of this before, but if you go to Cornell's nestwatch.org, they've got a portal there. Go through your Cornell account, many of you eBird, so you can just use that, sign in and check it out. And you'll have access to all the resources you need. They put the code of ethics right there, right up front. Dana talked about that. So that's really a cool thing to be able to like peruse through to make sure you're doing the right thing. Um, all the things that she mentioned, but they cover everything from the basics to finding and identifying nests. It's just a really cool resource that's out there, and that's on the online form and on the nestwatch.org. But you can interact with your data there once you start entering data. I like digital mobile data collection. I designed it for all of our science work that we do in the field, and it's kind of one of my things. And so I don't like paper data sheets. So this is really cool to me. And it's just nice to be able to use that companion app when you're out there in the field, and you can just kind of mark where the things are and start entering your data. And so here's some of our own data from our place. And you can look at all your stats right there. You can check out, you can check into the nests and what nest you need to go to next. It'll remind you of that. But here's a screenshot from my phone of that. Remember that Phoebe nest that we showed you earlier? That's right here. That's from the app. Here's the data in the app. But there's a lot of cool projects out there. Dana mentioned like purple martins and bluebirds. There's another one that we're quite fond of. Look at those cute, fuzzy little baby American kestrels. That's a photo from this year from our operations manager, MRBO, started this kestrel project. So there's quite a few people that are participating with putting up kestrel boxes, and we're actually banding some of them. And it's just a beautiful thing to observe. And I'll end with a nest box that I just kind of happened across, and I happened across several of these types of nest boxes in the prairie that are put up by master naturalists, and it's pretty exciting to check them out. Scary in there. And I decided to leave before I got my face ripped off. But that's all that we have for now. So we're happy to answer questions. And yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Ethan and Dana. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, just throw those into the chat. We'll start with a question from Sherry. Do cowbirds ever build their own nest?
I'm of the thought that they should be called bison birds, because that's really where they got their start. They had that nomadic existence following around the bison herds. And they're like, well, if we could stay here and try to raise a family, but all these bugs are with the bison. So let's just dump them off with somebody else and keep following the bison. So maybe the bison birds would be a little bit better. Now they hang around our domesticated cattle. But yeah, they still just have that habit. I think a female cowbird will dump eggs in like 40 of it, lay like 40 eggs in a year or something like that. So
and yes, I do not believe that there's ever been the documented cowbird nest making.
Next question, do all birds use their bodies to create the nest?
Yes. What do you mean would be the alternative?
Laura, if you want to put into a little more detail for the question, that would be great.
It's a lot of using of beaks, right, for weaving, for the nest.
Can I say clarify?
Yeah, please. Hi.
So we've had northern cardinal nesting off and on in a shrub by our window, and they shoulder their way. That's not even the right body part, but they sculpt the nest with their body, and it's an amazing thing to see how they just intuitively know that their body is a tool, like not their beak, but their whole body. And it's an amazing thing to see. And I was just wondering, do all birds use their full body as a way to shape the nest?
I see what you're saying. And we recently saw a video of an American robin doing what you just described, Laura, and pushing out the nest, which, you know, incorporates a lot of mud, right? And sculpting the bowl, the perfectly circular bowl, using their body, like shouldering. I think this is a really great way to say it. I'm not even sure we know the exact way that every single nest is built, but I would say no to that question. Like, I think some of it is done just with like weaving and use of beak. And then, you know, we've seen some where there's not much to it. Like it's literally a scrape, like they kind of just scrape away with their feet a little bit. It does seem like in a lot of cases where a nest is quite circular, even if that's a ground nest by a wild turkey or a Canada goose, right? They'd be using their body to make that more circular shape. But I don't think all birds would use their body based on the results.
But it is a great behavioral thing to identify and know that's what a bird's doing. So when we'd be looking for a cerulean warbler nest, we'd often see a female go up, and during like courtship, she would go to a spot where it looked like it'd be a good spot for a nest, and we'd say, oh, she sits spinning. So they sit and spin. And it's like already doing that motion because they have the impulse to do that motion, indicating this is a spot where I'd like to spin around and make a nest. And so it's a good thing that if you see a bird doing that, they're likely getting ready to establish that spot as a nest.
Right, very interesting. Next question, are there particular birds that prefer to build nests in fruit shrubs, such as a blueberry bush?
Eth, I'm happy if you want to go, but they choose nesting substrate, whether that's super open like a gravel bar or enclosed like a fruit bush of any kind or any sort of vegetation, based on the structure of that vegetation. Seems to be the way that like ecological choice is made. So I suspect that it has something more to do with that structure than the fact that it's a fruit bush. That being said, obviously there are birds that are more frugivorous than anything else. So like our orioles really eat a lot of fruit. However, I could see a tendency to be like, well, then they're, you know, a major food source is right nearby. However, almost all of our native bird species feed their birds insects, regardless of what their food preference is the rest of the year. So whether they're largely frugivorous or whether they're seed eaters like cardinals, for instance, even so, it's really like the insect biomass that's the important thing. So I would say, yeah, structure and presence of insects, which is often supported by native plants, as I'm sure you all have probably heard about. Eth, anything to add to that?
That's better than I can do.
Okay. All right. All right. Skipped on me. So someone is saying that they are currently observing an American redstart nest, and one cowbird chick hatched recently. The nest is difficult to see. Would the redstart chicks have hatched at the same time if there were eggs?
All depends on time laid, really. But they're so, yeah. That's too bad the brown-headed cowbird got in there, but I just love redstart nests. You know, one of my first field jobs was looking for redstart nests. Found dozens and dozens up in the UP, but those redstart nests, they're always in like a little sapling, and they're pretty easy to find. They're like some of the easiest nests to find, and so I always think that's easier for the cowbirds to find them too sometimes. But yeah, you have to just keep observing and see what the timing looks like, and see when feeding takes place. But those redstart eggs are so small. They're just like little jelly belly beans, you know, in there. So
Okay.
If
Last
you
call for
know-
questions.
I was just going to say, if you know a lot more about redstart nesting than I do from that project, but I would think that the hatching time would be similar. Like they're both pretty quick.
yeah, they're like 12 days, something
Mhm.
like that. Yeah.
We have to hope that the redstart chicks hatch at the same time, because the cowbird's going to outgrow them so quickly, right? That if they hatch the same time or maybe a little earlier, hope, then that would give them a shot against their big nest mate there.
It's such a sad thing to think about, because that little redstart worked so much harder, flying all the way up to Central and South America, came all the way up, and now some cowbird just takes the easy road, dumps an egg in there. It's just not fair.
All right. I was going to say last call for questions if anyone has one. And I'll ask a question of my own. Ethan, you recommended that people could monitor nests. Do you think that just regular old people with no like field biology training are okay to do that?
I think if they follow the protocols and the code of ethics that come with nestwatch.org, I think it'll just be use common sense and caution. And I think it'd be a wonderful way. Also, find others in your group there, or other people that may be doing it. Just tag along a little bit. I'm sure there's a bluebird group around, or some other people that are monitoring your nest, and just look over their shoulder if you're not comfortable. Yeah, I think it's just, I mean, and you don't have to be serious and methodical about the monitoring right off the bat either. If you're not super comfortable with that, just check it once a week, or just peek at it with your binoculars once a week, and just try to spend as much time you can observing, and just observing that cool behavior, and look at how hard those birds work. You know, one chickadee, you know, just flying back and forth, feeding 10,000 caterpillars to a clutch of babies. I mean, it's incredible to watch. So.
All right, thank you. I think that is all the questions we have this evening. I just want to thank Dana and Ethan one more time for presenting to our group. We really appreciate hearing about these nests and your expertise, as well as all of the really cute baby bird pictures. We really appreciate it. And I hope everyone has a good evening. Thanks, everyone.